Hey everyone, I'm back for the next video in this series. So at the end of the last video I mentioned that I wanted to explain the if statement better, and then I remember that I forgot to add a part of this code that will check if the specified layer exists, and if it doesn't, it'll create the layer. So this is an important feature to add because if you, let's say for some reason a layer accidentally gets purged or deleted, or it's missing from your template, or sometimes your standards are evolving, maybe you have a new block and a new layer accompanying that block. So this addition to the code will allow you to add that layer on the fly. So what I want to do is I want to probably put that new if statement right here. So if, and we're going to create a new layer. So I guess the next color in the order, color 1 is red, color 2 is yellow, color 3 is green, and I think color 4 is cyan, but or light blue, but we're going to find out in just a second. So what I'm going to do, if I'll just name it. So if table search layer cyan equals nil, we're going to do dash layer. Remember that you put the, oops, getting ahead of myself, command, and in quotation marks, dash layer. The dash forcing the command prompt version of the command, because you know if you type layer, that dialog box comes up. It's not even really a command, it just launches the dialog box. Dash layer, make. It would ask me for the layer name. I know this already, so I'm not going to go through it in the actual model space or paper space. I'm just going to type it out here. Layer cyan. It'll automatically set it to that layer. So I'm going to go color. And let's take a guess. I think it was 4. And it'll default. Okay, we'll leave that there for now. I'll just save my place. Okay, I'm going to click back in here. I'm going to go to dash layer, make, test, color, 4. Yeah, I guess right, 4 is cyan, test. And then you hit enter one more time to exit the command. Okay, so this should work. We can test it out here. The reason I'm not using the visual list console is because I want to see it change up there. So in this case, okay, so that was nice. Okay, so I just had to see what happened. One thing I did is I left this in the code. I'll show you what that was in just a second. But you're wondering why it didn't change to that color. It's because I changed this, but I didn't change this. But that suits me just fine because I can just copy and paste it there. So if I changed this and this to test 2, it would have made the layer as I wanted, but instead it just didn't change the color, and it got stuck in the command, but that wasn't a problem. Okay, so if this condition is true, do this, or else set var. Oh, what we'll do is we'll just okay, so if all goes well, this code will create the layer for us on the fly. Let's close that off. So I don't need to put anything here because this if statement is very condensed. I don't need the program because I only have one function for the if the condition is true, and one function for the or else part of it. And of course, I could get rid of that. That doesn't actually need to be there. If I get rid of that code, it just won't, this routine just won't change the layer for me. That's all. Nothing more. So no harm done, but it just reduces the functionality of the code. But just be aware that you don't need this argument. It'll still work like this, but we'll put the or else back there. So this way, this command also makes this layer that you make, it sets the layer automatically as well. So that's why I don't have to change the variable. And of course, oops. And of course, this is just as we see here. Doesn't really need anything more than simply this one line of code changing the variable for the current layer. But anyways, enough rambling. Let's see if this actually works. Let's load it. So as you can see, that layer doesn't exist in my drawing yet. Now it does. Perfect, so it worked. So since I had a bit of time left on the end of this tutorial, I decided to briefly introduce you to adding arguments to functions, or rather passing arguments to functions. I made this routine. I introduce a lot of new functions, but you don't need to understand how they work quite yet. Don't worry too much about these. I'll briefly explain them. If you want them explained in more detail, I recommend doing a Google search. For example, search WAL and AutoLISP on Google, and you'll have a few different really good tutorials and explanations come up. But anyways, so what this function does is it basically asks the user to input an integer. Then it passes that integer to this nested function that I've made right here. And then it displays the result in an alert box. So I'm going to show you what that does right now. I'll just type 2x, that's the name of the command. Choose an integer. If I choose a letter, it asks me again to choose an integer. It says requires an integer. I'll type 1.1, and again it asks me to choose an integer, so I'll type 2. 2 times 2 equals 4. Okay, that's comforting. I'll run that command again. Let's type 8. 16. Perfect. Run it again. So you get the idea. So I'll just explain that briefly, line by line. I'll just say that the nested function I have right here, this is what I really intend to teach you here. So all this code is doing, this first line, this is why I stress that it's a very good idea to always declare local variables. Because if this isn't set to nil, it could interfere with this while statement. This while statement, the start of it actually looks a lot like an if statement, and it basically does the same thing in a way. So while this condition is true, it'll keep repeating this. So what it's asking here, I'll show you exactly what that means. So if I set this variable to nil, I'll show you what this does. So while this user integer variable does not equal type integer, that means while this equals anything but an integer, it'll keep repeating this. So that's why when I typed a letter or I typed a decimal number, it kept asking me again to type an integer. So if you're using this while statement, I highly recommend you understand how it works 100% completely, or you could send yourself into an infinite loop that you can't get out of. You'll have to escape out of the Lisp routine. Not the end of the world, but something you'd prefer to avoid. Okay, so right here is where I define a function. It's a nested function. Don't worry too much about that C colon not being there. That just by not having that, it just means that it's not a command that runs on the command line. It only runs within an AutoLISP routine, or I could run it in brackets, either in the Visual Lisp console or my command line within AutoCAD itself. When I press enter, it's going to give me an error message. It says too few arguments because I don't have because the way I have this set up, since I put an argument right here, I have to supply that argument for this function to work. So let's type 4. So all this is it's a nested routine, and that routine requires an argument to be passed to it. So that's key for the next lesson. You don't have to understand this quite yet. I just want to give you an introduction of what we'll be working on. So of course, so it sets the result, it times 2 by whatever the argument is, and that completes the routine. So that routine's not doing anything yet, it's just constructed for later use. So sure enough, I set a variable to the result string. This function here, it just changes the integer that I collect from this into a string, because I want to combine that string into that alert box. This last line here, it's just an alert function, strcat, that just combines strings. So I have one string. This string is just taking the integer I collect up here and using this function on it to change it into a string. It's a confusing explanation, so I'll explain it again. So anyways, this little piece of code, I'm taking this integer and using this function to change it into a string. I'm combining this string with this one, and of course I constructed the result string right here by taking this integer to a string and passing my nested function to this function. Anyways, don't worry too much about how this routine works. Just be aware that the concept of passing an argument to a function is integral to understanding the next video that I'm going to post in this series. So stay tuned for that, and thanks very much for watching up to this point.